Hey, welcome back. I decided that for the last one we should have it in my living room again because it's kind of comfy in here. And this is the last chapter of Take Good Care of the Garden and the Dogs. And I wanted to thank you for spending April with me and for making this particular April a whole lot better than it would have been otherwise. And I also again, want to thank Mary Chapin Carpenter, my friend Mary Chapin Carpenter, who I've never met, but I have seen her twice, I think, live singing, and I know a lot of her songs. But she's the one who inspired me because I watched her do her little concerts in her house, and her dog Angus looks just like my dog Trixie, and I mean they could be brother and sister. And I thought, well, if she can do that, I should be able to do that too, if she's going to be that generous. And it's been pretty good. I also wanted to tell you that if you like this reading, I did read the audiobook for Find the Good, and I do the narration on it, and it's available on Audible. You can also get it, there's a little box with CDs. And I think it's at most libraries. And now, you know, the online libraries, you could probably download it if you have that at your library or state or county library. You can even get it on interlibrary loan. So if you'd like me to keep you company for a little while longer, that's a good option. The other thing is that my next book, which is called Of Bears and Ballots, An Adventure in Small Town Alaska Politics, is coming out in the end of June. And during that time, I'll be doing some more video readings. I don't exactly know how they're going to work, but I'll be reading from, there may be some of these included in that, but also I'll be reading from Find the Good, and I'll be reading from If You Lived Here, I'd Know Your Name, and from the new book, Ballots and Bears, too. So watch for that. It'll probably be in June, May and June. Yeah, and you can always go to my blog or send me notes, and I'm happy to stay in touch with you. But thanks for even teaching me how to do this. This is chapter 15, Take Good Care of the Garden and the Dogs, and this chapter is titled The Music of What Happens, and the epigraph is "O come, let us sing unto the Lord," and that's the Venite or Psalm 95. I hope Mimi Gregg heard our women's a cappella singing group before she died. Can I just start again? Just a little bit? Sorry, I want to just do it right. Get myself comfortable here. I hope Mimi Gregg heard our women's a cappella singing group before she died. She was still in Haines when we sang at the lighting of the fort at Christmas time. The choir really needs an official name, and this has been an issue for us, especially since our counterpart, the Men of Note, has such a good one. Women of Virtue was suggested, but that was quickly voted down, as was Lyrical Ladies. So we remain the new women's chorus, you know, the one Nancy Nash directs. Actually, we are now called the Haines A Cappella Women's Choir or Chorus. HAWK is our acronym. Took us a while, but we're still in existence, and that's what we call ourselves. We had practiced Hark the Herald Angels Sing and O Come All Ye Faithful just for this event in 4-part harmony. But we're not a church choir. Instead of cotta's and caps, we wore coats and knit ski hats and with headlamps on them. We stood in the inky dark behind Tresham Gregg's art shop on the parade grounds, waiting for the cannon to fire and the holiday lights trimming the classically gabled and porched homes to come on. Other folks milled around in the darkness. Milk jugs with candles inside them outlined the sledding hill where children coasted down and trudged back up. Then, from somewhere in the darkness, up by the flagpole, we heard Jim Shook holler, "Cover your ears!" And we all did, and then waited. Nothing happened. And yes, Shook really is his name, and you'll see in a minute how perfect that is. "Cover your ears!" Jim yelled again. One woman who was new in town wondered if that was really necessary since we were, after all, a couple of 100 yards away. We assured her it was. Jim's 3,000-pound cannon was originally designed to launch harpoons off whaling ships. It came off a sunken hulk in St. Michael, way out in western Alaska. The restored gun now fires on special occasions and is a fixture at Fort Seward. This neighborhood was once the first permanent Army base in Alaska. It was built between 1903 and 1905 and decommissioned after World War II, which is when Mimi and her husband and a handful of other investors bought it, sight unseen. Each firing of Jim's cannon takes a pound of black powder and a lot of old blue jeans. Jim packs the barrel with rags, and denim works best, lights the fuse, and then waits for the big bang. One time I shot a pair of Levi's clear over Tresham's shop, probably the farthest any pair of Levi's has ever traveled, he said. After the third cover your ears, there was a huge kaboom, followed by stunned wows. I felt the shock wave on my face and the ground shift under my boots. The background was suddenly dazzlingly bright as all the white and colored lights on the grand home surrounding the snowy field were lit. Todd Stevens launched some more fireworks and passed out sparklers, while Mary, Joseph, and the baby doll that was Jesus waited on the shop porch to perform a living nativity scene. I had not been aware of our choir's part in the pageant, of which our leader, Nancy Nash, seemed to be in charge. Turned out Nancy wasn't either. Holly Davis was supposed to do it, but she had come down with the flu. Holly was born on Christmas and has stayed faithful ever since. Her husband is Matthew, and their little boys are named Mark, Luke, and John. They have a little girl now, too. Her name is Margaret, but they call her Meg. Nancy is a born organizer, so she jumped in, enlisting her husband Dwight to do the readings, and instead of Holly leading the carol sing-along, our chorus became the main attraction. The script was right out of Luke's gospel, you know, the one that begins, "And it came to pass in those days that there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed." With each scene, we sang a verse of the corresponding carol, "O Little Town of Bethlehem," "Silent Night," "Angels we have heard on high," and of course the two we had actually practiced and for which we had waterproof music, "Wet Snow was falling in earnest." A couple of mothers herded dish-towel-hatted shepherds, tinsel-haloed angels, and gift-bearing kings to their places on cue. I stood next to a friend who didn't know the words to all the carols. I was heartened to learn that I did. I owe this to my mother, who made sure her daughters learned to sing whether we wanted to or not. For all our young lives, we sang in church choirs and in school choirs, and this time of year, we often sang at New York area nursing homes. Now that I've been in one, I understand how much that must have meant to the residents. My mother, an alto, was in the church choir too. I grew up assuming everyone sang and that singing was the most important part of church. For the 25 years I have lived in Haines, our church has been too small for a choir. So when Nancy began this community chorus a few months earlier, I signed up. As I stood in the snow, miles and years from where I first learned them, the words from Greensleeves, "And it came upon a midnight clear," came right back. It's an odd feeling to be almost 50 and realize that something you learned as a child has paid off. It's almost as surprising as discovering a use for algebra. Half the crowd missed all or part of the nativity play and carols. They were on the front side of the building, roasting hot dogs, or thinking about roasting hot dogs, on the bonfire of shipping pallets, throwing flames that threatened to char a nearby totem pole. Ever since my accident, I've made a habit of visualizing the worst-case scenario and how I will survive it, or even help others to. On airplanes, I note where the exits are and actually read the card that explains how to inflate the emergency slide that becomes a life raft. I looked at the inferno reaching wildly into the sky. A volunteer fireman agreed that if the pole caught fire, it would crash into the 50-foot tall lighted spruce tree, which would then burst into flames and fall down the slope onto the power lines, which in turn would send sparks over the derelict barracks building. The building is long vacant, so probably no one would be hurt, but the boom and flash of the crash and subsequent burn would make that cannon blast seem like a pop gun. To paraphrase Tiny Tim, God blessed us every one, and the fire stayed put. Pearl, come here. What's the matter? Pearl's looking out the window. I usually read to you at lunchtime, and it's closer to evening now, and they're waiting for Chip to come home from the store, and they're watching the people go by on the beach who are the evening walkers. So, my mother always made sure we read a Christmas carol each December too, and A Child's Christmas in Wales. She died concerned to the end that her Alaskan grandchildren may never know the words to English carols or the proper King James version of the Christmas story. Funny how this year we all heard both. True, they were accompanied by booms and blazes rather than delicately chiming handbells, but as St. Luke promised so long ago, there remains plenty of goodwill and great joy, and December's snow continues to fall on our little patch of earth with a kind of peace. Do you want to come up here? Come here. Trixie, decide what you're doing. Come on. Oh, she smells like fish. There's little fishies on the beach that have been tossed up with the wind, and she's obviously been chewing on some. In order for Mimi Gregg's daughter, Annette, to have some peace over the holiday, it was agreed that Mimi, who was elderly and frail and forgetful, and by then, oh my gosh, I better get that, just a second. Stay where you are, Trixie. Hello? Hi, how are you? Can I call you back in about 20 minutes? Is that all right? Okay. Everything all right? Good. Have you talked to Dad lately? Mm-hmm. Okay. Are you okay? Are you at home or are you at work? Okay. All right, I'll give you a call shortly. Okay. All right, bye. That was my sister Suzanne, and just checking on me. And Suzanne lives in Haines, and yeah, and we're both talking about my dad because he's up at his farm in New York alone, and we're a little, worried about him. We can't go there, and obviously he can't come here. And our other sister is stuck in Florida, where she has a broken leg. The pandemic, the timing just didn't work out for us. Anyway, let's get back to another mother and daughter, and I'll start at the beginning of that. In order for Mimi Gregg's daughter, Annette, to have some peace over the holiday, it was agreed that Mimi, who was elderly and frail and forgetful and required round-the-clock care, would travel down to Ketchikan and stay in the pioneer home there. Mimi was in Ketchikan only 4 days when she died in her sleep. It wasn't really a shock, but it was a surprise. She wasn't ill. Her family had not gathered at her side. She quietly exited life's stage without taking a curtain call. Maybe it was the timing over the holidays, which always remind me so much of my own mother, and maybe it was Haynes' deep December darkness, which no amount of twinkling lights can banish, and in spite of Annette's best efforts, the wind and snow had already shorted out sections of the fort lights. But I had a heck of a time writing Mimi's obituary, and it was a big one. Mimi was the first lady of the arts in Haines. Dying peacefully in the 10th decade of an extraordinary life is not tragic. What I'm missing most about Mimi is the way she was when I met her, the way we both were when we were younger. She was in her 60s, I in my 20s. I laugh now at how Mimi convinced me to direct the musical Carousel when I had 3 children under 6 and was pregnant with the 4th. When I insisted I couldn't, she said, "Oh, piffle." I know, that's really how she talked. "Oh, piffle." I still know the words to This Was a Real Nice Clam Bake and often hum the song about geraniums in the window. You know, it goes, geraniums in the window. I think he sings it though, winter, hydrangeas on the lawn, and breakfast in the kitchen in the timid pink of dawn. I might have had a baby to dandle on my knee. I could sing that whole song, but that's probably not why you're hanging out with me right now. Mimi's story is both wacky and typical of 20th century Alaskan pioneers. They were not what you'd expect. It's no doubt why Alaskans, especially women, remained so hard to pin to a type. Mimi could clean a salmon and cook it perfectly, and she was well educated, cultivated, feisty, and full of wide-eyed optimism about the North Country when she arrived in Haines on a steamship in 1947 with 2 small children. 2 more and a foster child would complete the family, and her mother, Regina Vicarino, an opera singer of French and Spanish descent. Madame Vic, as she was called, was a genuine diva. Mimi was also named Regina and nicknamed after a character in Puccini's opera La Boheme. She held a Messiah sing-along in her living room some Christmas times, something my mother would no doubt approve of. Her father was an ambassador in South America, and she grew up in New York City and Argentina. Mimi and the other babes in arms, as Mimi would have called her pioneering sisters, for Mimi all the world really was her stage, came to Alaska to join her husband Ted, who was part of a group of Washington, D.C. area veterans who bought the grand old officers' homes of Fort Seward and the rest of the Army base. The first summer was beautiful, fun, and exciting, her daughter Annette told me. But when winter set in, it was wicked, wicked. They learned a lot about credit and how bad the economy was. Annette's as dramatic as Mimi. Later, Mimi would serve on all kinds of regional and statewide tourism boards, cheerleading for Haines and Alaska. But that first year, Ted drove a truck and Mimi opened a gift shop, which she expanded into a travel agency. Over the years, she also taught school, worked for the legislature, and, as I do, wrote a column for one of the state's large papers, the Juneau Empire. Mimi was a shipping agent, too, and even the deputy magistrate. But all that was only how she paid the bills. Her passion was the performing arts. She helped found the Lynn Canal Community Players and our Arts Council. She hosted a weekly show tunes program called Matinee on the radio well into her 80s. She put on a lot of parades, concerts, and festivals, and helped to build the Chilkat Center for the Arts. She was the force behind the Alaska Community Theater Festival held at the center every other year for about 20 years. Mimi traveled to Houston and convinced the American Association of Community Theater Festival officers to choose Tiny Haines for the National Drama Organization's biennial festival. She did it while they were stuck in a broken elevator with her. In her day, Annette said, guys would lay down in a puddle for her. When Mimi decided to stage Damn Yankees during Haines' sawmill years, she recruited mill hands and loggers and taught them to sing and dance. I can't even begin to tell you how gracious a hostess she was, or all the gourmet meals we shared with an opera on the stereo and a whole crowd of guests in the living room. It was all seemingly effortless on her part. Maybe entertaining was connected to her love of performance. There's an art to creating memorable parties. Mimi even baked her own bread for its aromatic ambience as much as its taste, 6 loaves at a time in the oven of the old wood-burning cook stove in her kitchen. My first summer in town, Mimi talked me into acting in a melodrama for tourists. We sang a duet together about going way out west and finding some place that's known to God alone, just some place to call our own. We'll find perfect peace where joys never cease. And we waltzed around the bar on the set. That fall, she nominated me for the Lynn Canal Community Players Board. I was thrilled. Turns out half the board were newcomers. Our first meeting was at Mimi's house, and she was there, along with all the former board members. We all worked together. That's how she recruited new people to be involved in the arts. Mimi probably would roll her deep brown eyes if I told her that she was on the forefront of such popular ideas as community sustainability or mentoring. It's common sense, she might say. Everyone knows that if you want something done, you ask a busy young person to do it. I hoped Mimi's window was open a crack that snowy night of her last lighting of the fort. I hope she heard us singing, because mainly when I think of Mimi, from her operatic name to her radio show, I think of music. A long time ago in old Ireland, the mythical warrior and hero Finn McCool asked his followers what the most beautiful music is. They answered with all kinds of sounds, from birds chirping and hounds baying to swords clashing and a pretty girl's laughter. Finn McCool waited until they had named all the finest music they could think of. Then he said that the most beautiful music in the world is the music of what happens. In my life, a lot happens while music is playing. I listened to those songs of Compline when I was in the Seattle nursing home recovering from my accident. Thanks to Mimi, I heard show tunes every Saturday morning when my children were growing up. She played them religiously on the radio. My mother may have been listening to opera when she was mostly gone from us. My father put a CD of her favorite arias on the stereo when we brought her briefly home the day before she died. None of us could stand to have her at Mount Sinai another minute, so we had an ambulance bring her home up to the farm, and we settled her in the living room on a twin bed I had set up there. They say hearing is the last sense to leave the dying. My mother always had good ears. As an assistant principal of a Quaker high school, she was the one in charge of discipline, and students believed she could hear them clearly through walls. My sister, my father, and I sat by the bed where Mom lay completely unconscious and toasted her with glasses of wine. There was so little of her left to recognize, even the dogs were shy. Forsythia branches bloomed yellow in a vase, and sunlight streamed in through the windows. My family was not as comfortable with home deaths as I was. My dad would not have been able to sleep with my mother dying right in the house. It was too hard. My sister agreed, so we called the local ambulance crew a few hours later, and the volunteers, including a young woman Eliza's age, gently lifted my mother on the gurney and took her to the small hospital in nearby Sharon, Connecticut, where her doctor had a palliative care room waiting. We stayed with her there until after 10 and then went home to bed. She died the next day while we were out to lunch. As with Mimi, she exited privately. At her funeral, everyone sang, "O friends in gladness, let us sing, supernal anthems echoing, Alleluia, Alleluia." It was beautiful, all those voices in the full church, but I had trouble raising the glad strain in my heart. I didn't sing with them. And my mother died in April, so it was right around Easter, so the hymns at her funeral were Easter hymns. And so all those Alleluias, even still on Easter, it's a challenge to sing them joyfully. I did sing at Mimi's memorial service, which was really her last show. It was at the Chilkat Center for the Arts, and Mimi herself was there, or at least her ashes were, in a pink porcelain urn that wore her pearls and occupied center stage. Her son Tresham said Mimi didn't believe in the afterlife. She felt you better make the most of what you have because this is it. He said that not having faith in a world beyond this one is what inspired Mimi to live so well. A former kindergarten teacher and opera singer who had moved to Juneau came back to sing a selection from La Boheme, and our women's choir sang 2 sacred songs, as well as the zippy I Feel Pretty and the jazzy Someone to Watch Over Me. Nancy and Dwight performed a duet of Goodbye Old Girl from Damn Yankees that made everyone cry. Afterward, Nancy mused that a woman's chorus was a fitting metaphor for Mimi's life. She got everyone singing along, and in the end, got us to do more than we could have done alone. Yeah, choir as a fitting metaphor for Mimi's life, and maybe for yours too. She got everyone singing along, and in the end, that got us to do more than we could have done alone. Summer arrived this year like a battle of the bands. At low tide, choirs of gulls and terns on the mudflats sang so loudly that I had to come in from the garden to hear what a caller was saying on the mobile phone. Last night, the sea lions were rocking out on Pyramid Island. The low clouds threw their growls into my open bedroom window. I woke up in a kind of sleepy way and listened to my teenage and young adult children and their friends playing guitars and mandolins and singing out on the deck into the evening. The cries of shorebirds blended with the strains of that same sweet question of what Amy wants to do. I think I could stay with you for a while, maybe longer if I do. Chip was sound asleep next to me and didn't move when I smoothed his bald head. He's tired. He's been hunting for hooters. Not the nightclub, rather the birds, which are blue grouse. The males add to the seasonal din with a hoo, hoo. It's close to the sound made by blowing across the top of a deep bottle, only louder. Hooters can throw their hoots up to a mile, so you can't easily tell where they are by following their calls. The hardest part of hooter hunting is finding them, but once they see you, they don't move. They stay frozen, even after you move in very close, which is why Don Nash said, "Even you could shoot a hooter, Heather." He was at the stove at the time, turning strips of the beer-battered grouse in sizzling oil. "No, I couldn't," I said. "Sure you could," he said. "It might take you a few tries, but you'd hit one." That's not what I meant by couldn't. I meant I liked the hooter's song too much to silence it. In the dusk of high summer, I listened for a hooing hooter, and I looked at the sign taped to my bedroom door. Bride's dressing room was written in light blue calligraphy. There was still a flower pot in the driveway with a similar sign stuck in it announcing "Wedding this way," and another one on the back door steering guests clear of the house because the bride and groom would like some privacy. My friend Frankie had made them. Her husband is the pastor of the Haynes Cornerstone Foursquare Gospel Church, and Frankie decorates the library at Christmas. It's so pretty you'd have to see it to believe it. When she heard that our daughter Sarah was getting married, Frankie asked if she could be our wedding planner. Frankie reads all the decorating and entertaining magazines. She said it was important to have a theme. I said it would just be an Alaskan family beach wedding. She looked at my family and at the beach that we live on and said, "That'll work." Then she told me to weed whack some of the seagrass down in front and to have the kids move those driftwood stumps to use as stands for the buckets of flowers. While we worked, the sea lions exhaled with explosive wet breaths, eagles whistled, and trumpeter swans honked as they passed the house on their way up the river toward Chilkat Lake. The backbeat came from the putt-putt of a fishing boat's diesel engine out off Pyramid Island and Christian's dirt bike backfiring in our gravel driveway. I asked Frankie what we would do if it rained, and she said it wouldn't. If you'd like, you may now come Here Comes the Bride. But we didn't hear that tune because Sarah didn't have that kind of wedding. When the tide was just about high and the sun had burned off the morning mist, before the breeze picked up, and while it was still warm enough to not need sweaters, just before I started down the beach rose-lined path from the house to the shore to take my seat on the picnic benches set out like pews, I thought I might faint. I am not a dizzy spell kind of person. Maybe it was the champagne we had sipped a few minutes earlier while Sarah was dressing, or maybe it was the spontaneous tears between Sarah and Eliza that I had just walked in on, or maybe it was that I felt so fortunate, so rich in love, to borrow the title of Josephine Humphrey's book, that my heart felt as if it were a helium balloon in my chest. Maybe it was the Spirit taking hold and making me fall on my knees in gratitude for being here, right now. Then my son, Christian, offered me his arm in such a grown-up way, the same way he had at my mother's funeral, when I had been suddenly unable to walk down that aisle to the family pew all the way up in the front. This time, my nerves were happier. When we neared the familiar faces of our family and good friends, all standing out there in the sunshine, I said hi, and everyone laughed. I mean, it was still just my backyard, and they were all staring at us. I know that Frankie wanted a real procession, but this is us, and we are not that formal. Chip and Sarah came next. All the while, two French horns played a classical round on the trumpet and French horn. Two friends played a classical round on the trumpet and the French horn. The horns were Chip's idea. He had been silent about the wedding plans until one evening, a few weeks earlier, when he announced that he had asked the music teacher and his gifted former student to play. After 26 years, he still surprises me. We had had horns at our wedding because my mother had insisted on it. Handel's trumpet voluntary. That trio wore tuxedos. This duo wore clean jeans. But the music they made in that outdoor cathedral made me swoon. I did still manage to overhear Brian, Sarah's groom, whisper to his brother, "I'm so lucky." Sarah has had a crush on Brian since they met on the softball field 3 years ago. Chip and I weren't so keen on him then, not because of anything he did or said, but because he is 16 years older than she is. Brian, to his credit, sensed our discomfort and asked me to lunch so we could talk about his intentions. Brian is charming, and I am easy to charm, so I sent Chip instead. This is what fathers are for, I told him. Afterward, when I asked Chip if he had given Brian the what for, he said Brian bought him a beer for lunch and that he's actually a really nice guy. Then he put his arm on my shoulder. Heath, he really loves Sarah, and she loves him back. Just the way we did, and still do. It was like a country song, only this was my daughter, and I was not so easily moved by reality. I was walking later with my friend Becky and doing the when she's 60, he'll be 75 math, when Becky said it would be a shame to pass up present joy for an unknown future. She said I could obsess about all the years between them if I wanted to, but I'd never know the sum of them. None of us will. Becky knows that's true, and so do I. He could die in a boating accident. She could fall off her bike. She could also live to 90 and die in her sleep. He would be 106 then. Seriously, looking at Sarah in that white dress next to Brian in his suit, standing on the beach with the sea and the mountains behind them, and all the people who loved them gathered close, I knew we were right to give her and Brian our blessing. Life is too short and too unpredictable to take a pass on love. Also, it is a great joy to see your daughter so happy. Stoli and JJ were happy too, in the matching little blue dresses and ballet shoes they bought because they wanted to look like bridesmaids, even though Sarah wasn't having any. They performed a song they had written for the occasion. Well, them and the Beatles. They used the tune from Yellow Submarine and added their own lyrics, such as Brian loves Sarah more than ESPN and Sarah loves Brian more than the color blue. Then Eliza and Brian's sister delivered the wedding rings. Brian's brother Brad pronounced them married. He's not a minister, but this is Alaska though, and by now you know this is how we do most weddings. However, Jan did give the blessing, including a traditional Irish prayer, and she wore her collar to be sure it was official. After they kissed, we clapped, and then Christian and Stoli played Walk the Line on guitar and mandolin. Someone opened a cooler full of beer and soda pop, and the cold cans were passed around. We all hugged and smiled while Nishan were singing from the lumberyard took pictures. Then the wedding party headed up for the bigger bash on the parade grounds, where everyone in town was invited to eat and dance. The Nashes, with Christian deckhanding, had caught some of the salmon, and Sarah and Brian's fisherman friend Stuart, who was once a star on my cross-country team, provided the rest. A couple of Chilkat River rafting guides grilled it, and all the guests brought a side dish to share. Frankie's kids ran around clearing plates and refilling platters. A bluegrass band from Juneau began at 2 and quit at 7, but the party kept going, and Brian and our kids and Chip's brother Steve and his wife and our friend Liam, and well, just about anyone who wanted to, kept playing and singing. Linus was dancing with a dentist from Juneau, who asked, "So where's your husband?" I wasn't sure that would happen if Linus was recovered enough from her own car wreck of a divorce to keep dancing. She shouted back, "I don't have one." And he declared, "Well, this is my lucky day." And they boogied on. My dad told me my mother would have approved of the trumpet and French horn. This was just before he took his new lady friend for a twirl on the dance floor. They'd been dating for a few months. As Dad explained when he broke the news, he's 74 and doesn't know how many years he has left, and he doesn't want to be sad all the time. Sure, he misses my mother, he said. They were married just shy of 50 years. But life goes on. Those aren't the only changes. A couple from Colorado has built a vacation home next door to us. They brought in a backhoe operator to pull up the 20-year-old trees blocking their view of the water and the mountains, then transplanted them between their yard and ours. What do you think? My new neighbor asked, pointing to the new woods. It's amazing, I yelled over the grind of the machinery. Will they live? He nodded yes, with all the authority of a brand new Alaskan. They do this all the time, with 90% success. His optimism reminded me of Mimi, whose Christmas trees were always the nicest natural trees in town. When I asked where she found them, she explained that they always cut two, drilled holes in the trunk of one, and stuck branches from the other one into them. That worked, so maybe this will too. When the backhoe was shut off and the crew had quit for the evening, my old neighbor, Linus, whose family has been in Alaska for 100 years, walked over to inspect the changes and share a beer on the beach with me. She's a grandmother now. Eliza will be her colleague at school next year. Yep, my oldest has been hired to teach first grade in Haines. I often wonder if my children would have come back after college if I hadn't been so badly hurt, and if they hadn't had to learn so young that you can't count on the future. But just because you stay in one place doesn't mean that time stops. Linus and I knew the meadow next to the salmon smokehouse we share would never be the same now that a home was going up in it. And we also knew it was bound to happen. But we didn't talk about that. There was nothing we could do about it anyway. Neither of us could afford to buy the lot. Instead, Linus looked at the transplanted trees and my coil of garden hoses, took a sip of her beer, and said, "A mature Sitka spruce tree needs 200 gallons of water a day." Then she asked, "How deep is your well?" Deep enough, thanks to another good neighbor we once had. A small plane took off way down at the airport. The tide flowed by Pyramid Island. Somewhere on the side of Mount Rapinski, a hooter hooed, and down the valley, a distant avalanche rumbled. Through an open window, Stoli, who was Linus's goddaughter, played Stormy Weather on the piano. Farther down the beach, Christian and my nephew James threw a baseball, smacking it hard from mitt to mitt, while a puppy raced back and forth between them, barking. I thought about all of this, and a bunch of other scenes too, as I lay there that night with Chip breathing beside me. I should take Frankie's wedding signs down, but I didn't want to just yet. I want to be the mother of the bride just a little longer. I hummed, "O friends in gladness, let us sing," and the Alleluias that followed it. And this time, I didn't cry. The window was open again, as it usually is this time of year, and I heard the voices of our children and their friends who were singing down by the fire on the beach, as they often do this time of year. They were too far away for me to make out the words, but it's the music that counts, and I can hear it as clearly as the beating of my own heart. The old Irish hero was right. The most beautiful music in the world, or at least in my world, is the music of what happens. That was nice to read. Yeah. Sarah and Brian now have 2 children. My oldest grandchild is 10, and their other daughter is 7, and then there are now, every single one of my children now has a child, which is kind of remarkable, and it wasn't something that I told them to do, but the last 2, JJ and Christian, just had babies in January in Australia and in March in Juneau, which brings my grandchild count to 9. 3 live next door. Stoli, who's my youngest, and her husband Nels have an 8-year-old and a 6-year-old, and Teddy, who was named after Nell's father, who was a fisherman who died in a fishing boat accident, just turned 1. And Teddy turned 1 on the same day that my mother died. So that's something good about April. Thank you very much for letting me read to you, and thanks for coming into my home. And I look forward to seeing you again sometime soon, maybe on the next book tour or maybe some other way. And if you ever get up to Haynes, I'm easy to find. You want one last picture? You can see Trixie on the couch. I can give you a little bit of turn around. You can maybe see outside. Oh, and there she is. Yeah, and that's the view out the window, and that's the room where I was when I got hurt. So, till we meet again, stay well, take good care of yourself, and be good to each other.